Elihu and for Jesus, these things then are, as it were, the most important choices we're ever going to make. Sometimes suffering leads to the most vital, self-defining choices we will ever make. They're going to lead us to the point not only of choosing higher meaning, but making choices that will be, of course, definitively self-defining for us. And Elihu says, that's a good thing. And Jesus retains it and says, it's a good thing. And St. Paul says, it's a good thing. Thank God I've got this thorn in the flesh, this angel of Satan. And he means it in the sense of demonic, this angel of Satan to beat me, to keep me from getting proud. I don't want to be Mr. Proud. I don't want to be Mr. Conceited. I don't want to be Mr. Narcissistic. I don't want to be Mr. Shove God out of the center and be in the center myself. I don't want to be God for anybody else. And boy, I've got a great safeguard and it'll get me out of the middle, get me out of the God position. My safeguard is the wonderful, wonderful thorn in the flesh. It's such a gift. Now, of course, what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? Very probably he had the same disease I did. He had very, very bad vision. Not from the beginning, but worsening vision throughout his life. So we see that in the Philippians letters, in the Corinthians early letters, Paul's writing them himself. Suddenly, by the time Galatians comes around, Paul says, I'm just going to write the introduction in big print. And then so-and-so is going to be my scribe and write my letters. Why so? Paul too busy? How does that explain the big print? Or in Acts 28, remember when the high priest comes into the room to interrogate Paul? Paul says, what have you to do with me, you whitewashed wall? And the servant goes, is that any way to talk to the high priest? And Paul goes, excuse me, sir, I didn't know you were the high priest. Now, Paul was a Pharisee, right? Before he knew what a high priest looked like in full trial regalia. Looks like a whitewashed wall to him. I mean, he's going blind. He can't go. After the second missionary journey, Paul can't go anywhere, but he's got to have a companion. Whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong, and a lot of exegetes think I'm right, just kidding. Paul's got a thorn in the flesh, and he values it. His blindness is making him humble, or his thorn in the flesh, it's a physical malady of some kind, is making him humble. And as he gets more humble, Christ dwells in him more strongly. He doesn't have to worry about, becoming a Jim Jones, a Messiah figure, a kind of a crazy sort of crypto, take the place of God kind of a guy. Doesn't have to worry anymore. He's being saved by his weakness, which he calls his strength. So this third strand is incredibly important, right? So we see that Paul, not just Paul, but Jesus, right? Peter himself in the first letter of Peter, are all reiterating a short moment you're going to have these afflictions. But don't worry, these afflictions are going to lead to something good. Something good for the resurrected life. Something good for your self-definition. Something good for your progress on the road to becoming people of compassion and love. Something good, in terms of the development of your faith and the reliance upon God. Something good on your being able to go out there and have the courage to bring hope to the world in the midst of a culture that would like to beat you up. And literally something good so that you won't have to, be number one in the success list you can be number 10 in the success list, which is going to make you a much more effective disciple before others. That's basically it. Of course, it's Elihu squared, right? Because Paul and Jesus are amping this third, scriptural interpretation up. They're going to, amp up Elihu's interpretation, make it much, much stronger. There's a fourth and final strand in the book of Job, which is, again, it's a good book. And Jesus retains this one. And basically, this is how it goes. Elihu, right, is confronting Job. And Job's saying, woe is me, woe is me. I have been a righteous man. And that he had, right? And Job's saying, because I'm a righteous man, could God have been just and treated me like this? And Elihu goes, surely you are not saying that your view of justice to yourself is better than God's view of justice to you. Because, says Elihu, there's one thing I'm sure of. God is more just than you are, Job. And when he says that to Job, he really means it. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to give him a pastoral letter. He's not trying to give him the law. Job, God's more just than you. He's trying to say, Job, be careful, because you're getting really arrogant. I know you suffered a lot, and that's a terrible thing. But one thing you got to avoid, basically, I'm going to translate Elihu for you. Basically, the one thing you have to avoid is blaming God or accusing God of being unjust. You can be angry with God, says Elihu. That's fine. Be angry. I would be angry too. And by the way, get right in there and just say, God, I feel abandoned. Jesus did that too. Or you can get right in there and just go, I'm miserable. Leave me out of here. Why are you doing this to me? That's fine too. But when you step over the line and go, because you did this to me, you're unjust. Elihu goes, whoa. Once you get into the accusatorial mode and you're telling God he's unjust against your criterion, you are not a loving God. Elihu says, be careful, Job. You start making those accusations, and you may find out he really was loving. And you may find out that your view of love in substitute is much worse, and that this could carry you to a place where you do not want to go. Be careful about the accusation. Be angry. Be abandoned. Be in pain. Oh, and of course, the Hebrews were great at lamentations. Complain! Kvetch! 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 But don't accuse God of being unjust or unloving, because there you really do not know. Now, of course, we know that the great apologists, the church fathers, had a really good explanation for this, which I very much buy. And what is that? See, my suffering is not at the center of the universe. Here's God's problem. My blindness, or Paul's blindness, or somebody's grief, or somebody's loss, or somebody loses a job, or, student gets a bad grade, I don't know. It's okay. Some suffering, okay, is there. But here's God's thing. God's going to, he's going to keep working in the world. He's got to bring good out of suffering. He's got to bring resurrection out of every cross. But this is a monstrous task. I mean, it's huge, because my life touches not only the people who are around me as friends and co-workers. I mean, it could touch the people like yourselves who are just maybe listening to a lecture. And my suffering could touch, lots and lots of people. I speak to truly tens of thousands of people a year. And so, it could touch all those people. And of course, you touch so many people. And the people you touch other people. And so God has to make sure that as He's leading us out of our suffering, He's going to lead us to a better place in the alleviation of the suffering rather than to a worse place. What Elihu's trying to tell Job is that the immediate alleviation of his suffering is not God's primary objective. God's primary objective, and I'm going to do this from the Christian perspective, is fourfold. Number one, the salvation of your soul. Number two, the salvation of all the people's souls around you, the people who you touch. Number three, the preservation of your freedom, so that you have the freedom to choose at every point along your life's path. Number four, the preservation of the freedom of everyone around you whom you touch. Then finally, you can get to 5 and 6. The alleviation of your suffering and the alleviation of the suffering of the people around you. In that order. In other words, what Elihu started and what Jesus and Paul finish is that we got to look at this from God's perspective. And that is, there's a whole lot of people out there. And salvation is much more important than alleviation of suffering. The preservation of freedom is much, right? So if I'm going to do something that's going to cause you to suffer, right? God can't go, up. Spitzer's about to do something that's going to cause suffering to Joan. And of course, just, give me some kind of a shock, which will not make me do it. It will prevent me from doing it. And he then starts behaviorally conditioning me like a Pavlovian dog. Every time I'm about to say something, I get another shock. And of course, finally, I say to myself, okay, I'm going to be really respectful of Joan. It's coming from my heart, right? It's coming from the shocks, right? And so God's not going to do that. He's not going to start stepping. He's not even going to do it for, in case of Hitler, right? He's going to preserve the people's freedom. That's the whole deal. Freedom, we have a high price to pay, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But that's the sixfold perspective of God, as it were, according to both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. That's precisely the priority. It's too much for us to figure out, Elihu tells Job. It's too much. We don't even know what's good for our own salvation, for our own self-definition towards salvation. How in the world can we know how our lives are going to be good for somebody else's salvation and their self-definition towards salvation? And how in the world are we going to know what's going to be good for the preservation of our freedom and their freedom? Then we can talk about alleviating mine and other people's suffering. It's too much. Too much. So basically what Elihu is saying two things to Job. Number one, don't tell God, you got the right thought, and he's just, a pure mental midget, and, he doesn't know what he's doing, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Elihu says, that's a bad assumption, because it will lead where? It's going to lead to complete error in your lives. If you start saying that God doesn't know what he's doing, start saying that God is unjust, you think you know the plan better than he does. You know your own salvation better than he does. You know the salvation of the people you touch better than he does. The minute you start really believing that, I would say that's the point at which you have to be your own God. Because now you've just isolated God right out of your life. God's not going to get mad at that.